tour right now, I guess I should start with, for a new book that just came out called Nomad, Spirituality for Traveling Light. And really, this book is the culmination of my spiritual journey over the past 5 to 7 years. As you've heard a little bit, most of this book was written while I was a student at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, which is a conservative fundamentalist school where I went in 2010 to get my degree in pastoral ministry to become an evangelical pastor. Now, the worst idea you could ever have is to put a Bible college in the middle of Chicago, right in the heart of downtown Chicago, because I'd go to class during the day and be told, basically indoctrinated with these beliefs that I was supposed to adhere to, and I did. But then in the afternoon, after class got out, we'd go hang out in Chicago. And I went to Boys Town, and I found LGBT people that loved God and had beautiful stories. And I went to mosques with my friends and found God in the midst of Muslims. And I kept running into God places God wasn't supposed to be. And so Moody's whole education began to kind of unravel while I was in the process of living in Chicago. And I say even today that my education, my undergraduate education, wasn't from Moody, it was from Chicago. The city taught me far more than I ever learned in the four walls of the classroom. Because Moody's an interesting kind of school. When you enter in Moody Bible Institute, you sign a doctrinal statement. And in order to graduate, you have to sign that same doctrinal statement, meaning that for 4 years, there's not supposed to be growth or change, just that you've gotten more solidified in your beliefs. And how much of our religious systems in the United States and in the Western world today are like that? That we're not expected to grow or progress or challenge any notions of authority or truth. Instead, we're supposed to maintain the party line, and if we do, we'll make it to the end, die and go to heaven, and that'll be the end of it. But while I was at Moody, preparing to be a fundamentalist pastor, I started reading the Gospels really intensely. And I began to discover in the person of Jesus the same thing that I'm sure many of us in this room have discovered. That so much of what Jesus taught and preached and so much of what he embodied, we as Christians are taught to do the opposite of. So, for instance, literally, this is a very common teaching in the evangelical world today. I was taught that the Beatitudes of Jesus he taught us them so that we could see how sinful we are. They were never meant to be something that we could actually fulfill ourselves, but they were supposed to show us how high God's standards were and how we could never achieve that and needed God's grace. So what I was being told was that Jesus' words weren't applicable and they shouldn't be applied in my own life, but I should look at them, realize my sinfulness, and just continue being a Christian. But that didn't seem like what Jesus required of us. And so I began to dig deeper. And like Rich said, I got to have the amazing opportunity to host a radio show on Moody Campus Radio where I got to interview some of these leading theologians who I thought were heretics. People like N.T. Wright, Tony Campolo. And at the end of my first semester, I got to interview a guy named Brian McLaren. And as soon as we announced that we were going to interview Brian McLaren, who is kind of well known in the evangelical world as being a heretic, as soon as we announced we were going to interview Brian, I got an email from the Dean of Students at Moody that said, "Brandon, your show's canceled, and we need you to come meet with us in our office immediately." I walked into the Dean's office, not sure what was going to happen. And when I came in the room, I sat down in front of a panel of 3 professors who began to ask me questions about what I believed about the Bible, about homosexuality, about hell. And they said that because I was talking to Brian McLaren, they were afraid for my salvation, and that they didn't know if I could still be a student at Moody anymore. Now, at this point, I was still a good fundamentalist. I still believed all the same things they wanted me to believe, and so I passed their inquisition with flying colors. And I got out of that meeting, and they said, "We can't kick you out because you clearly believe the same things we do, but your show is still canceled, and we'll be watching you for the next 3 years. If you make a mistake, you're going to be done." The long story short is, over the next 3 years, I was called into meetings like that 6 more times. Because as I walked out of that room that day, I realized for the first time that there was something fundamentally wrong with this system that I was a part of. That the scriptures teach us that the perfect love of God casts out all fear. And yet, what I was receiving was nothing more than fear of people that we didn't understand or even know. One of the reasons I wanted to interview people like Brian McLaren and all of these heretics was because I kept hearing people talk about them, but nobody ever talked to them. Nobody ever asked what they actually believed or why they believed what they believed, and I wanted to do that, and I wanted to expose our campus to that. And so, over the next 4 years after walking out of that meeting, I started a blog called Revangelical, which stands for Rethinking, Reforming, and Renewing the Evangelical Faith. And I said it was going to be my mission to stay within Moody Bible Institute and stay within the evangelical tradition, but really deconstruct what this fear was. Why we had to be conservative Republicans, why we had to believe this certain set of doctrines, and why we couldn't talk to or fellowship with anyone who thought or believed or looked or acted differently than us. And over the next 4 years, as I said, I experienced God in so many different places. And as many of you probably know, the more you begin to question your theology, stuff does begin to unravel. It is indeed, I believe, a slippery slope, but in the best way possible. I began to question certain things about God and the Bible based on these people I was meeting. Turns out that Brian McLaren was more like Jesus than any fundamentalist pastor I had ever met. And I sat under this teaching and I kept wrestling with this notion that if these people were so wrong, why do they look so much more like Jesus? Why does the Jesus that I see in the Gospels spend so much time with people that the religious people considered outsiders? Jesus didn't consider them outsiders. And so I continued down this path, and during the same time I also started admitting to a small group of friends my struggle with same-sex attractions, as we would put it. And as I began to talk about this with friends, I was introduced to a professor at Moody who was self-proclaimed ex-gay. And I started meeting with him and sharing my story and journey with him. And he was one of the most affirming and loving and gracious people that I'd ever met. And he walked with me on my journey and encouraged me and gave me support. Until about 2 summers later, my summer of my junior year, when I was at Wild Goose Festival, which might be the first time that we actually met. I was at Wild Goose Festival and I was doing interviews with more heretics. And this time I interviewed a woman named Nadia Boltzweber, and I got my picture with her. And when I got back to school that August of my senior year, I found out that this professor who had been mentoring me about my sexuality had found this picture of me with this crazy pastor, Nadia Boltzweber. If you know her, she's like 6.5 foot tall and tattooed and cusses a lot. My professor had found this picture and emailed it to the entire faculty, outing me as LGBT and saying, basically, look at who Brandon is hanging out with. If we don't do something about this now, he's going to end up becoming gay. And so I got back to campus that my senior year, and again was called into one of these meetings. And this time, I was told in no uncertain terms that if I didn't prove to the school right now that I had good intentions and that I was going to follow Christ with my life and reject my same-sex attractions, that I would be kicked out. So they highly recommended that I begin a reparative therapy program at Moody. They couldn't make me do it, but they highly recommended it to prove my allegiance to the school. And so I began a year's worth of reparative therapy, a version called Healing Prayer, where I was meeting with an ex-lesbian professor at Moody. And once a week I'd go in and confess all of my sins and get prayed over with holy water and crucifixes, which is something you would never expect to find at Moody Bible Institute, but it was there. And what I found in that experience was that I was actually experiencing a lot of healing. A lot of what we were doing was going back to trauma in my life. I grew up in a home with an abusive alcoholic father and a very mentally ill mother, and just a lot of bad experiences. I'm the typical kid that I fit this typical reparative therapy image of a kid who would be gay. Over-attached mother, abusive and distant father equals gay child. And so I was in this program and we were working through some of that trauma, and I experienced so much healing from that. But by the end of that year, I found that while everything else in my life was becoming whole and healed, that my sexuality was only feeling more secure. And I didn't have the theology to justify it, and I didn't know what this meant, but I just felt like I was becoming more of who I was supposed to be. And so when I graduated at Moody in 2014, by the grace of God, I walked across that stage, grabbed my diploma, and ran as fast as I could. And Moody actually has a history of revoking degrees after you graduate, so I've been lucky to, I've ordered a couple of degrees and have them, they cannot take them away. I'm quite proud of that degree. I've been on a journey since then, beyond evangelicalism, to figure out what is happening in our world. Because, like I said, I imagine that this story, maybe not to this degree or not in the same ways, but this story of discovering the rigidity of conservative religion and wanting to step beyond these boundaries is something that so many people in this age are experiencing. And the story that I kind of root this book in and root my journey in ever since I was 12 years old and first became a Christian was a story of a guy named Abram. In Genesis chapter 12, we're introduced to a guy named Abram, and Abram's walking in a field, and all of a sudden Abram hears a voice, and the voice says, Abram, leave everything you have behind, your family, the land of your inheritance, everything you've ever worked for, leave it behind, and begin walking, and go into a land that I will show you. If you do, you'll be blessed and be made a blessing to many. And in verse 4, the first 3 verses are God speaking. In verse 4, it says 3 of the most profound words in the entire Bible. So Abram departed. In this moment, Abram has the faith to step beyond boundaries. And if I were Abram, I would have wanted to at least pray about it for a little while, maybe ask my spouse about it. We're not told he does any of that. We're told he packs up and takes the first step. Beyond all that he knew, beyond all that he inherited. And what he discovers is a life beyond limits, a life that he could have never imagined. A life that is filled with, yes, trials and tribulations and turns around every corner, and yet a life where he truly is blessed and becomes a blessing to many. And since I was 12 years old, that story has been an encouragement to me that the true life is found not within the boundaries and borders, not within the confined systems of where we're told we must stay, but when we step beyond those boundaries, we enter into this vast landscape where we can discover a life we've never dreamed of being possible. LGBT people know this, who find that freedom to live out their faith in a way that truly embraces who they are. And so many other people experience this as they step beyond a religion, a version of religion that suppresses who we are. Because the Christianity that's promulgated today in many of our churches is one that tells us we need to conform to a singular image. We all need to think the same, act the same, believe the same, look the same, dress the same. But the Apostle Paul wrote, and I'm sure you've heard, be not conformed to the image of this world, but be transformed. If we worship a God who is truly expansive and eternal, and if we worship a God in whom we live and move and have our being, if we worship a God that is this diverse, doesn't it make sense that humanity, who is made in his image and likeness, would be just as diverse, just as expansive, just as queer as our God? And when I stepped beyond that boundary for the first time, when I was a freshman at Moody, and then continued to step beyond those boundaries, I've continued to find that life isn't about having the right answers or confining God by a list of attributes. Life is about wonder, which is the message of this book. I begin chapter 1 of my book with a chapter called Wander, the value of stepping beyond the boundary. And I end the book with a chapter called Wonder, which is what I believe is the goal of all true religion and spirituality. It's not to have the right answers. It's not to check the right theological boxes. It's about looking at your life, looking at the bigness and beauty and diversity that surrounds us in every moment of every day, and standing in awe of it. Because God is that beauty. God is in the midst of all of the difference and diversity that surrounds us. God isn't found in the boxes of right theology or the right creeds. God is found in the diversity, the messiness, the bigness. And every mystic and sage and prophet from every religious tradition around the world has always known that when you call yourself to be present in this moment, and you look around at the people and the beauty that surrounds you, that it's in that moment we are most connected to God. For in God we live and move and have our being. Christ is in us the hope of glory. We are partakers in his divine nature. We cannot be separated from God because God is the ground of our being. Amen. And when we understand that and live from that, we are called to be our truest selves, and our truest selves are our queerest selves. The truest self is the self that you know deep down, but have had to suppress and hide because society tells you you can't be that. This doesn't only affect LGBT people, this affects all people. How many straight men wanted to be in choir and play piano but thought they couldn't because that's what girls did? This notion affects us all. And the gospel of Jesus is the realization that the kingdom of God is here. The kingdom of God is within us. That when we step into our truest self and let our light shine forth, that we will see the world as it's meant to be. And that's what I've come to realize over this short journey of faith. And that's what I try to take around the world as I've gotten to travel and speak and write over the last few years. Not because I think I have anything unique or extremely wise to say. I'm still figuring all of this out. But what I have found is that when I have stopped trying to conform myself to the standards that I was told God wanted me to conform to, and instead trusted in the wild winds of God's Spirit, that is where I found more life than ever before. That's where I found freedom and love like I've never experienced before. Jesus said in John chapter 3 that the Spirit of God is like a wind, and it blows, and no one knows from where it comes or where it goes. And then Jesus says, so it is with everyone born of the Spirit. Our lives are not meant to be on straight and narrow paths, forgive me. I'm contradicting Jesus there for a second. We could get into that another time. Our lives are meant to be lived by leaning into the wild river of God's grace and letting it take us wherever it takes us. Most often into lands that God's not going to tell us about. Notice that when God talked to Abram, God didn't say, I'm going to take you to this land on this direction. He said, no, trust me, I'm going to take you to a land that I will show you. We don't know where our lives are going to go. We don't know where the Spirit comes from or where it goes. Life is about trusting in the beauty and the moment that we have right now. And in that, we will find life, salvation, and the kingdom. And so to kind of end and wrap this up so we can get back to more beer and more hymns, I just want to read from one page of the last chapter of my book that kind of really encapsulates this whole message of wonder. And it tells just a brief story of a time where I first came to this realization of the bigness and beauty of God and life. I begin the chapter with a quote from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a Jewish mystic, who said, "Our goal should be to live a life of radical amazement, for to be spiritual is to be amazed." As I stood on the edge of Lake Michigan, looking over what seemed to be a never-ending body of water, tears formed in my eyes. The light of the city glittered in the distance, and the deep purple skies began to melt into the horizon. As the gentle breeze wafted across the lake and surrounded me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was surrounded by the very presence of God. The turmoil and anxieties of my life lay just behind me in the city, but in this moment, I stood, breathed on by the Spirit of God that whispered silently to my soul, "All is well." This moment was a work of divine art, painted by the very hands that formed my soul. This moment was all that I needed to know that everything was going to be okay. I didn't know what awaited me the next day, the next week, or next year, but that didn't matter. Being concerned about the rightness of my beliefs in this moment seemed laughable, because what words could I ever formulate that would describe what I was experiencing in this moment on this beach? This simple, ordinary moment was all that it took to fill my soul and to restore a deep peace to my heart. This moment was all that I had, and it was more than enough. If I've learned anything in my short journey of faith, it is this: that in every circumstance or situation, there's a vast, untapped beauty lying just beneath the surface. I believe that beauty is what we call God. Divine beauty isn't flashy or ostentatious. Instead, it's raw, it's simple, it's modest. When we live our lives with eyes wide open, looking for God's presence in each and every moment, good or bad, we will live lives of peace, lives filled with purpose, lives filled with wonder. That's what it means to be a Christian, after all. Beyond all of our theology and traditions and practices, to be a Christian means to live every moment consciously aware that in God we live and move and have our being. This is the message Jesus came proclaiming when he said, "The kingdom is in your midst." The kingdom is nothing more than the world waking up to the reality that God is our source, the animator of all that is seen and unseen. When Jesus called for us to be born again, it was so that we could see the kingdom of God, or become aware of the presence of God in and around us at every moment of every day. When we're awakened to this reality, everything changes. The way we treat our neighbors, our friends, and even our enemies is fundamentally transformed because we understand that they too exist in God's presence. As Paul says, we are all his offspring. If Christ is the force that holds everything together, then everything that exists is sacred. Every moment is holy, every second is pulsating with divine elegance. What would our lives be like if we actually believed all of that? How would we live? How would we face trials and challenges and pain? When we recognize the beauty of God and the beauty of everything else, we cannot help but live with praise on our lips and joy in our hearts. Spiritual nomads in every religion have come to this one fundamental realization, that the way to true and abundant life is to learn to live one's life with wonder. To live our lives with wonder, that is what I believe it's all about. So thank you guys so much for being here.